Hello everyone, this is Lucas with the general topic analysis for November-December. This one should be fairly quick. A lot of the details will be covered by the other coaches, but I will be focused on a few things that will be in the next slide here. The structure will be the resolution and how you should approach the resolution from a very general focus. I will start by saying I don't think that this topic will be very complicated in terms of the interpretations that you could hold. Ultimately, it is a very general statement, but the terms are quite specific, which leaves us with not too much wiggle room to mess with the terminology, but we'll still explore it as much as possible, and this will be a general overview that you can use. Besides that, this topic analysis will be covering how I see the affirmative going, and from the light research I've done so far, what arguments I'm seeing is plausible. And the same thing for the negative, but in general, those two sections will be shorter, and the specifics you'll find in the other topic analysis that you'll be seeing from the other coaches. And the conclusion will just be a wrap-up. So that being said, I say we get started. If you see a definition in here that you find important or you find useful, you will be able to find it in my card file. So don't worry about having to cut those. They're all already cut. So the resolution is resolved. In a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office. I think getting back to this thing I was saying about this being a very specific set of terms inside a general statement rings very true when you read it. Most notably that the topic is very general, a right to know before right to privacy. It doesn't get very complicated when it comes to the actual clash, but the parameters of that statement, that it has to be a democracy, that it has to be a candidate, that the candidate has to be for public office, take this very general debate and really zone it into a very specific situation. That's going to have a lot of ramifications on the topic as a whole, and it's going to have a lot of impacts on how you research. I believe making research very, very specific and ultimately making the topic a bit narrow, but it is what it is. So now we'll approach a lot of the key terms in here one by one. The first key term is democracy. The definition I have is a very general definition: government by the people, either directly or through elected representatives. Ultimately, I believe that will be the most commonly accepted definition. Because there's a little bit of difference in how people view democracy and the different forms of democracy, you may see some arguments that go so far as to detail that certain countries meet definitions of democracy and others don't. And it would be a good idea to explore further what the developed research details as to what a democracy is or isn't. You'll see below that I highlighted democracy versus democratic republics. The colon is a mistake, excuse me on that. And you'll notice that, also the footnotes, I got rid of those. It's okay. You'll notice that there is a slight difference, right? And there's a definition that I put in my card file that details how the difference between a democracy and a democratic republic is that in a direct democracy, which I believe is the one the article really highlights, there aren't inalienable rights, such that at any moment the majority could sweep away whatever concern based off of an elective decision or based off of a pure vote, right? Which means republics have a set of inalienable rights typically codified through a Bill of Rights or through a constitution of some sort that democracies that are very direct wouldn't, such that you could see some very stringent definitions of a democracy that we probably wouldn't accept in general for this topic, but someone will still try to read on you just to really push you on how far the definition of democracy goes. And ultimately, you should consider researching how valuable this shell would be on your own terms, or perhaps just being prepared for someone who goes for a country that could be considered democratic, but is not necessarily a democracy. And I think that's going to be a big deal here. There are countries, for example, that are transitioning into democratic institutions or are moving towards democratic institutions, but don't meet the threshold for what we would commonly consider a democracy, such that they probably do not get access to states that are transitioning to democracy, because those are still autocratic usually and are in an entirely different set of, I guess, contexts or problems that this topic ultimately does not seem to be focused on. This gets back to something that is missing in the topic, which is a specific state. Usually our topics will be United States. This one is international, but I think that because democracy is such a specific term, I do not see this topic getting out of the Western world. Democracies are typically restricted to the West, and I think because of that, in general, you won't see a lot of hyper-specific arguments because most other countries outside of the West are transitioning into our common understanding of democracy, one that has been very rigorously defined. So, in general, expect a Western hemisphere and Western society type debate, but more often than not, I don't think it'll go deeper than the United States in any instance. And if someone contests the United States as a democracy, you should be on the better side of that debate, although you should definitely be prepared. Ultimately, not the most consequential term, but it is significant enough to focus some attention. The next, and another footnote, my mistake, is the public. The definition here, I think, is very encompassing of what this debate could ever come down to. Relating to or involving people in general rather than being limited to a particular group of people. Ultimately, I think common usage, this is just not going to be an issue. I don't see people being very explicit about what the public will be. Perhaps they could argue that your mechanism does not meet the burden required of translating something to the public, i.e. putting something on Twitter might not put it to the people at large, but ultimately, not only do I think that that is false, but I think that in general, publicizing information meets the threshold required to make the public have their right to know met. So while I don't think it's too consequential, I do think that if you find a little bit of something deeper, there may be something to dig out here, especially for very convoluted affirmatives, or affirmatives that are like, we should let an independent board view health records, for example, and then let the public know things that they consider pertinent. You could argue that that is not sufficient to meet this threshold of the public's right to know, because ultimately the public does not get to fully know the information. But yeah, I mean, it's worth considering. It's worth at least thinking about and perhaps doing some light research on. The next is a right to know. I believe that this definition is quite good. It is of or relating to policies and laws that make some governmental records and other information available to a person who can demonstrate a right or need to know the contents. Effectively, if this is relating to governance and I can demonstrate that I deserve to know it, that would be a right to know policy. I think that this definition is particularly good if you're trying to defend that they have to move beyond philosophy and into implementation, considering that it speaks directly to laws and policies, which means this kind of is a solid definition for this implementation debate. But more overarchingly, it does clarify that a right to know is something that has to be codified. The best example of what right to know looks like right now is like workers' rights. Their right to know, for example, if they're dealing with material that is dangerous or other specific restrictions that companies have that require them to detail information for workers. I think about certain chemicals and stuff like that. That's a good example of what a right to know law looks like. And ultimately, while I don't think this will be necessarily the most relevant thing ever in the round, I do think that this kind of implementation question will come up more than once. So having a definition like this in your back pocket can be extremely valuable, because you could argue that they have to implement the affirmative rather than defend like a very general philosophical, oh, well, I mean, we should do this on a philosophical level, which I never think is particularly strong or compelling, but it will still pop up more often than not. This kind of gets into this next thing, this ought to be. There's a bit of a philosophical slant here. You're going to see a lot of times of the year people saying ought means X statement. Ultimately, on a personal level, and especially on this topic, coupled with the definition I provided on right to know, I find this to be inconsequential in that if you were to replace it with should, I think they're equivalent. And I think that ultimately this is just asking for a policy or some kind of approach that details how the public should know more about candidates' lives. I do think that this is going to require at least some research and some discussion on the team's part, but ultimately find it to not impact the debate much other than like some very tricky definitions that frankly I don't think are worth going into more than just realizing that they're going to be tricky more than anything. So yeah, the next one is this right to privacy. The right to privacy refers to the concept that one's personal information is protected from public scrutiny. U.S. Justice Louis Brandeis called it the right to be left alone. This is part of the definition I cut. The rest talks about how the right to privacy is protected by law, which goes even further for this right to know being a law thing versus a right to privacy being a law. Ultimately, I think that this is going to give much more credence to the affirmative action having to be an implemented policy rather than just a general obligation statement. That makes complete sense. So this legal approach versus philosophical is just another way of me saying that if they're going for these ought arguments, right, like, oh, we ought to do this, but we don't necessarily have to actually do it. This is another thing to refer to that says no, right? The right to privacy is codified, and the right to privacy is settled law, such that you need to have some kind of policy to combat that. Ultimately, again, I find this to be a not very consequential term. The right to know versus right to privacy, again, is that general kind of central statement to the resolution that isn't very complex, but the context around it is. So I will not spend much more time on this. I don't think it'll affect too much. Candidates, I don't think will do much more than restrict the amount the affirmative could do. Ultimately, what's important is that you realize that candidate requires filing as a candidate, at least in the United States. And I cut a definition that speaks to that. You can find in my card file. That says that you have to file for candidacy. So you can't, for example, when Donald Trump is holding rallies, insofar as he hasn't filed to be a candidate, he isn't a candidate. He's simply campaigning. So when someone campaigns, it doesn't make them a candidate. So if someone was to say, oh, Trump should release his tax returns right now, that would probably not be topical. And in general, you're going to find that it's going to be very restrictive, this candidate's term, number one, because it is plural, which means it's very hard to justify, oh, this specific candidate should have this happen to them. So specificity is going to be harder to garner on this topic. And secondly, something that's important is that public office kind of determines what the candidate is for, right? I could be candidate for my school's club, but that is not topical. Or I could be candidate for CEO of a company, but that is not topical. And ultimately, the requirements of public office are going to modify what a candidate specifically is. So if you were to focus your attention on the more in-depth resolutional elements of these phrases, right, on what are the specifics of a candidate, you should start with public office. And from there, you're going to find the specifics of candidates, rather than the other way around. And on that note, public office, I was struggling with this one. I did a good bit of research looking into what constitutes public office. This definition, a job in the government that you have because you were chosen or elected, I don't think is the best one, but was really one of the only general definitions that I found. This definition is interesting because it uses the term in the government. I think that there are some jobs that are public that are not government, right? This is the next bullet point, which is a public official or a public servant, that you could argue is an extension of a public office, even though it is not explicitly government. This is making me think like police officers or social servants or social agents or other officers of the law that don't necessarily make you think government. Ultimately, if we can derive public office from public official, I believe that opens up the affirmative to a few more affirmatives that are viable. For example, someone trying to run for police chief, which I believe is an elected position, for example, would be someone that could be the affirmative could exist for if a public official like them was part of a public office. So a little bit here to dig into. Ultimately, I think this will be quite important, and people are going to do their best to open up what a public office entails, because that's going to give them more opportunities. So I highly recommend digging into this more specifically and getting the confines of what a public office entails. The last bullet point here kind of talks about how that's going to be difficult, because public office is different per country, per region, per state, per jurisdiction, such that it's going to be a little difficult to find general definitions that you can apply. But ultimately, I think that this debate is going to be one of the more important context-providing debates in the definitional level. And I think if you were to focus your definitions research somewhere, this would be a good place to do so. With that being said, that wraps up our resolutional proper analysis. There will be more as the topic goes along, but I believe that ultimately it won't get much more complicated than this, which is that democracy, candidates, and public official or public office are going to be the biggest points of contention, and right to know, ought to be, and right to privacy are going to go relatively untouched. Who knows? Could be proven wrong. We'll see. And now we'll move on to my general opinions of the AF. The first one, small potatoes impacts, is to say that really this is a very small topic, right? I mean, it's restricted to candidates, which means they're already running. It's restricted to democracies. It's restricted to public offices, which means that that level of restriction means that you're not going to be very convincing if you start ranting about extinction. Don't get me wrong. I love a good extinction debate, but ultimately the link level here is just, I do not think, ever going to provide enough to really back that up. So I think because that is true, it is smart to invest a lot of energy into these strong, nuanced, smaller impacts, right? Yeah, even if it doesn't lead to extinction, you could have some really strong legal or social impacts that are smart and well developed. So ultimately, I would hope that when you're doing your research, you don't say, oh, here's a small link to transparency key to nuclear war. No, I don't think that's best. I think that's just going for a strong take on a well-formulated legal perspective on transparency is going to take you a lot further than these kind of low-level extinction or low-hanging fruit that an extinction impact could provide. Beyond that, I think the main and pretty much the only real general topic this app is going to cover is transparency. By transparency, it's just, yes, the public's right to know. Your reading is going to deal with the amount of transparency that should be provided. All your arguments are going to deal with some level of transparency, and ultimately, that's going to be the only thing that's going to be relevant here. I listed out 5 things that could be relevant: health, past political affiliations, finances, general honesty, and validity. A few of these I don't really know how we would put into practice as law, for example, past politics or honesty or validity. Ultimately, this is going to require some specific research, and you're going to realize what the confines of the resolution are, and you're going to realize what can actually be implemented and what is viable and what isn't. But these kind of feel like the 5 big ones. Health also encompasses genetics, and finances would be like tax returns or campaign disclosures or donations, I suppose, and things that could maybe slip under the radar without very explicit processes that are part of law. But yeah, I don't think the affirmative is going to get too much more complicated than a straight-up transparency debate. Something of interest is perhaps like tangential affirmatives. So, for example, right, the affirmative plan, right, all FBI background investigations should be public. right? So you look at Kavanaugh right now, and the latest FBI background check is in a locked room at the Capitol, and senators can only see it for an hour. No one's allowed to talk about it too much. So you could maybe argue that that would be a way of dealing with the right to privacy of candidates because it discloses elements of their past, right, or their past politics or their honesty, and it does so in such a way that justifies a right to know. That's a difficult one to justify, I think. I don't know if it is explicitly topical, but that's kind of the fringe of transparency here that you should expect to pop up throughout the topic. But ultimately, the affirmative doesn't get too complicated here. And with that, I will move on to the negative. I think that this one will be much more philosophically oriented and will kind of speak to a conservative Enlightenment philosophy type thing. The next slide will detail a little bit more on what I think of the individuality. Ultimately, the negative approach is going to say, hold your horses, right? My life isn't subject to public scrutiny, and candidates' lives shouldn't be either. And I believe that the other TAs will go over how this topic is going to be difficult to get really strong substantive prep for. And in general, the negative is going to be more focused, by and large, on these overarching, philosophically oriented rights claims that are being made. And likewise, I do not think you'll be finding these heavy extinction impacts very accessible. You need to be looking for just generic disads and generic NCs, and then really need to be focused on prep to the individual arguments that were detailed in the last slide, right? So you should have very specific arguments to health-related affirmatives, or very specific arguments to privacy-type law stuff when it comes to past politics, etc., etc. But on the general level, if they just go for a whole res affirmative, you're not going to find much specific. What you are going to find is that you as a negative are going to be able to test the limits of the affirmative's policy option. So if they just say, well, we should know more about our government figures, that's going to open the door to a lot of plan-inclusive counterplans. For example, right, if an affirmative is like, we should know all about a candidate, a great plan-inclusive counterplan, in my opinion, is, okay, we should not know their address or other personal information about their day-to-day lives. That seems fair, right? This gets into a problem of doxing, right, which could lead to hate mail, spam mail, death threats, literal death attempts, bothering their family, bothering their close family. There's a degree of privacy about day-to-day life that's I believe, undisputably valid. And I think if the affirmative does not do very well in clarifying the limitations of what they're defending, the negative is going to have the opportunity to be like, okay, but this specific instance we need to watch out for. And ultimately, that will take a lot of this general rights-based arguments and hone it to a specific situation. So I think one of your best friends is going to be plan-inclusive counterplans here. Definitely look out for those. Definitely start looking around for those things that everyone should have privacy rights to. And you'll find a pretty strong chest of arguments to pull from. But yeah, overall the negative is the same. It's going to be fairly generic. It's going to have to be very specific to the affirmative that's brought to the round. And you're not going to find much big stick stuff. We're talking small potatoes all around. And here is this individuality thing. This is from a book that I really love, that I read quite recently, which is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. It's not extremely specific to this topic, and let me pull the book out from my shelf here. He has another book called Representative Government, which might speak to this more, that I haven't read. This might be worth looking into. I'm reading the chapter list right now. But honestly, this seems much more technical on the actual processes of governments. So, in general, I think that this quote I give kind of speaks to Mill's position, which is that, if this doesn't affect you, you shouldn't know about it. And ultimately, even Mills concedes that to a degree when it comes to social welfare, there needs to be some kind of discussion about this. But I think if you dig into individualist philosophy, you'll find a lot that says no, full stop, privacy rights are more important than anything else. And I think that you could find a great ally and overall a great book in On Liberty. Highly recommend that book. Love it to death. And this is kind of an example of an individuality-based argument. I believe that you will find much more specific stuff in the philosophy topic analysis. On that note, I believe that's the last side. I don't think this topic is going to be necessarily complicated. I think that there isn't going to be much wiggle room, right? And I'll go back to the topic itself. Such that you're going to kind of feel like there's not much to do here. The good news is that there aren't as many tournaments, so really you just got to focus on getting the great arguments in on those very specific tournaments and do very hardcore prep and very technical prep. And from there, you'll realize that this probably has a lot more to offer than meets the eye. Just don't expect it to be very broad. It's going to be very deep. Hopefully you found this helpful. Please contact me in the Slack or where